The Story County Recorder's Ledger for the fall of 1932 shows one entry that has been underlined twice in ink, in the Minds and Adits column, in the clerk's careful hand. Corinna Bly, single, age 23, resident of Gold Hill, applied for a permit to enter the sealed Anselm adit under the terms of the Abandoned Property Statute. That entry is the whole of the official record. What Corinna Bly did after she went in has to be pieced together from the account she gave later, from the papers her father had left her, and from the last car of an ore train that had been stalled in the mountain for 100 years, and that no living person, until she pulled its handbrake up in the dark, had touched. If a story about a woman who chose to walk into a mountain instead of walking away from a town is worth 2 minutes of your evening, take that minute and hit the subscribe button and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It helps the channel find the people who need this kind of story most, and it keeps the ones we make coming. Her name was Corinna Bly, called Rena by anyone in Gold Hill who had known her since she was a girl. She was born in the fall of 1909 in a 2-room frame house on B Street in Gold Hill, 3 doors down from the Yellow Jacket Engine Works, and half a mile up the grade from Virginia City. Her father was Warren Bly, a Cornish timberman who had come out to the Comstock in the 1890s as a boy of 16 with an uncle from Camborne, and had made his living in the drift timbering of the deep silver stopes for the whole of his working life. Her mother was Louisa Marlowe Bly of Grass Valley, California, who had grown up in gold country and married Warren in Virginia City in the spring of 1908. Her family word was Maitea, in the Basque of the mother-in-law, who had come up to live with them for a year after Louisa's father died. Maitea, meaning beloved, in the mouth of a woman who had learned only 2 English words in her life and had used Maitea in place of every other endearment. Rena was, in the manner of Comstock children, a mine child. Her father took her down at the age of 6 with a brass carbide lamp of her own that he had made her at the Yellow Jacket Works, and he showed her the ways of the drift and the crosscut and the winds, and he taught her, over the years, what a mine man knows and what a mine man's daughter can learn if she has the head for it. She had the head for it. She learned to feel a rail bed with the sole of her boot and to know from the give underfoot whether the track was set solid rock or on backfill. She learned to read the color of tunnel timber for age and the depth of a heeled spike hole for stress, and the shape of a subsident sag in an overhead crib for the direction the mountain had settled after the crew had left it. She learned, above all, the tramway trade, the small-gauge railroads that ran ore cars out of the Comstock, stopes to the mill portals, and the men who kept them, the rail inspectors, the track walkers, the tunnelmen who could tell you where a lost car sat by the sound of the ventilation, and where the ventilation was still fair by the sound of the lost car. Her father was a timberman, not a rail inspector, but he was a timberman who had walked every abandoned tramway in the Comstock at one point or another for the sake of the timbering, and he knew every stall and every siding and every dead-end drift where a car had been left to age with the mountain. He passed that knowledge to Rena in the years he had left. He did not have many. He was killed in a rock burst in the deep of the Ophir mine when Rena was 18, on a shift he had told her that morning would be his last. In the deep because his lungs were going, and he had been thinking of retiring to the Yellow Jacket Works as a timber shop foreman. He was buried in the Silver Terrace Cemetery above Virginia City on a cold, clear morning in November, and Rena wore his brass carbide lamp on her belt to the graveside because she could not, that morning, think of any other thing to wear. Her father had left, in his will, the frame house on B Street and a small share in an unpatented claim on the west shoulder of Sun Mountain in equal parts to Rena and to her mother. Louisa was 51 and had never worked outside a house in her life. Louisa was not, in the winter after Warren died. Well, she sat in the front room in the daylight and did not speak much. In the spring of 1928, she married one Melchior Trask, a bookkeeper for the mill combine at Virginia City, a widower with a courteous manner and pale eyes. Rena did not object. Rena thought perhaps her mother needed a shoulder to lean on and a set hour for supper. Melchior Trask was, however, the sort of bookkeeper for whom the ledger was always to the good of the ledger keeper. Within 18 months of the marriage, he had persuaded Louisa to sign the West Shoulder claim over to the mill combine at a price that turned out, when Rena made herself understand the numbers, to have been a fifth of the market. He had persuaded Louisa to put the frame house on B Street into a trust of which he was sole administrator. When Louisa died in the fall of 1931, of an illness that Melchior described to the Story County coroner as a fever, and that the coroner accepted, Melchior produced a trust document that named him sole beneficiary of the B Street house, on the ground that the house was to be sold to fund the last of Louisa's medical bills. Rena was 22 when her mother died, and 23 when Melchior gave her a week to be out of the house. She read the trust document on the second night. She knew her mother's hand. The signature on the document was her mother's, but it was her mother's hand of the last month of the illness, when Louisa had barely been able to hold a spoon, the letters shaky, drifting off the line, and the language of the document was language Louisa would never in her life have used. Rena did not fight it in court that winter. She had no money for a lawyer. She did what a Comstock daughter of a Comstock father does. She took the brass carbide lamp off the mantel. She took the small log cabin syrup tin she had used since childhood to save quarters. She took her father's timberman's fro, the one he had made himself out of a wagon spring in the Yellow Jacket shop. She took her father's railwalker's notebook, which Melchior had thought was only bookkeeping and had not looked into. She took the mongrel dog Slate, who had been her father's since she was 15. She left the house on the 7th morning. She walked up the grade to Gold Hill and rented a room from a widow who had known Warren on a promise of $2 a week, paid in labor, at the widow's boarding house kitchen. She took the room and she opened her father's notebook and she read it through. Warren Bly had recorded, in that notebook, in his own neat hand, every abandoned tramway drift he had walked in his 40 years on the Comstock. He had recorded, in an entry dated the summer of 1918, a walk he had made into an old adit on the west shoulder of Sun Mountain, the Anselm adit, opened in 1832 by the small independent Anselm and Payne combine, and sealed in 1833 after a rock burst had killed 6 men. The Anselm and Payne combine had been carrying, on the last day the adit was worked, an ore train of 6 cars, the last 2 loaded with high-grade silver ore that had come out of the small rich stope the combine had been developing at the head of the crosscut. The train had stalled inside the tunnel on the morning of the rock burst. Nobody had ever gone in for it. The adit had been sealed with cribbing and blasting rubble, and the mountain had been left alone with what was in it. And Warren Bly, in the summer of 1918, had walked in through a ventilation shaft he had found on the west shoulder and had touched the last car of that train with his own hand. He had not brought anything out. He had noted, in the margin of the entry, the reason. The ore was not, in truth, his, and the train was not, in truth, his, and he had wanted to leave the mountain the dignity of what it had held. He had noted, at the bottom of the entry, that if his daughter Rena should ever come to the point of needing what he had left her, the ventilation shaft was on the west shoulder, above the 3rd pine, and the walk from the shaft to the last car was 730 paces. at a bearing of 112 degrees, and the abandoned property statute had been amended in 1921 to allow the recovery of stalled ore in adits older than 75 years. And Rena was to know that the mountain had been keeping her a school fund. She read the entry 3 times. She read it a 4th. She put the notebook down and looked at the dog. Slate did not know anything, but he thumped his tail. She said aloud, "All right, then." She spent the winter learning. She went to see Waldo Ipes, who had been a Comstock rail inspector for 40 years and was 71, and lived alone in a small stone cottage above the Union Consolidated Mill. Waldo Ipes had known Warren well. Waldo Ipes had walked as much abandoned tramway as any living man on the Comstock, and Waldo Ipes had been the one who taught Warren, 40 years back, most of what Warren had known about the trade. She sat with him 3 afternoons a week, from November to April. He taught her the small refinements her father had not had time to teach, how to read the pattern of drip lines on tunnel timber, to date a stall, how to smell the difference between fresh ventilation and old air, how to listen at a sealed crib for the small far echo of a hollow drift. He gave her his own hand-drawn map of the west shoulder of Sun Mountain, folded soft with use on the March morning he sent her off. He said, when she took the map, "The mountain lets you in slow. Do not hurry it. If you feel wrong, come out and try again next week." She thanked him. She meant it. Waldo Ipes had also, over those 5 months, told her about the Anselm ore train. He had been in the drift himself, once, in his 20s, on a private inspection for the mill combine. He had seen the last car. He had seen the driver, a man named Bertram Aish, whose skeleton had settled against the brake wheel of the last car when the rock burst had killed him, and he had not gone further in. He had come out. He had never gone back. He said, at the end of his account, Bertram Aish was the dispatcher. He rode the last car out on that shift because he did not trust the brakeman with a high-grade load. He rode it because he had already lost a son, and he was not going to lose a train too. He lost the train anyway, and he lost himself with it. Waldo Ipes told her that if she went in and reached the last car, she was to know Bertram Aish was still there, and to treat him gentle. She filed the permit at the Story County Recorders on the first Monday in September. She paid the $2 fee in dimes and quarters out of the log cabin tin. The clerk underlined her entry in ink because he could not that morning quite believe the entry. Word traveled up the grade to Gold Hill by noon. By supper time, the whole Comstock knew the pool hall in Virginia City had money on it before dark. The odds were 4-1 against her coming out with anything at all, and 8-1 against her coming out at all. Her real trouble, however, was not the pool hall. Her real trouble was Melchior Trask, who came to the widow's boarding house on the Tuesday morning with a piece of paper in his hand and said the west shoulder claim, which the ventilation shaft in fact stood upon, had been sold to the mill combine 3 years back, and Rena had no legal right to enter the adit from that side. He said it in his bookkeeper's flat voice, with his pale eyes on her, and he waited for her to give in. She did not, she said. The abandoned property statute is a state statute. The mill combine's claim is a private claim. I have the county recorder's stamp. Melchior looked at her a long moment. He said, "You are much like your father." Rena said, "That is the point." Melchior left. She walked out to the west shoulder on the Wednesday morning with Waldo's map, her father's carbide lamp, his froe, a coil of new rope, an oar hook, a shovel, tea in a small pot, and Slate at her heel. She found the third pine, and above it the ventilation shaft, a square opening in the granite, cribbed with old timbers. The cribbing rotted at the top, still sound below. She lowered herself in on the rope. Slate she left tied to the pine with a blanket for the wind and a bowl of water and a small tin of jerked beef. He whined once. She said, "I will be back tonight." He accepted it. The shaft went down 20 feet. The drift at the bottom ran east exactly as Waldo's map had said, at 112 degrees for 730 paces. She walked. The carbide lamp threw a small round of yellow light before her and left the rest of the tunnel dark. The ventilation was fair. The smell of old air was there, but it was not the smell of a truly stagnant drift, because the shaft above her was still bringing in a thin breath of the mountain's own turn. She kept her hand out and touched the timber. The timber was old, but sound in the places she checked. The rail bed was good. Her father had walked this drift 12 years back. Waldo had walked it 30 years back. The drift had been walked. It knew her step. She reached the train at pace 680. She saw the last car first in the small yellow round of the lamp. The wooden ore box with its iron hopper corners, the brake wheel upright, the small dark shape leaning against it that Waldo had told her would be there. She stopped. She said aloud, in the dark, "Mr. Aish, I am Corinna Bly, Warren Bly's girl. I have come to look." The mountain, of course, did not answer. She had not expected it to. She walked up to the last car with her hand out, and her light held low, out of respect. Bertram Aish had been dead 100 years, and was, in every way that mattered, part of the timber now. She would not touch him. She had brought a small canvas she had cut down that morning for the purpose. She laid the canvas over him. She said, in the same quiet voice, "I will not disturb you. I will look at the ore, and then I will come back and lift you out and bury you proper, if the county lets me." She would learn, in the months that followed, that the county would let her and would help her. That Bertram Aish would be buried at the Silver Terrace Cemetery next to her father, with a small stone paid for out of the ore he had died guarding, and that a Virginia city minister would say words at the graveside, because Rena asked him to. She went to the last car. She lifted the brake handle. It moved. The car moved half an inch and stopped, because 100 years of rust had bonded the wheels to the rail. She got down on her knees with the oar hook and worked at the coupling between the last car and the one in front of it, and it took her the better part of an hour to free it. When she had it free, she stood again and set both hands on the brake wheel and turned it a quarter turn. The car sighed and settled and did not move. She let it be. She looked into the ore box. She sat back on her heels. Silver ore, high grade, bright even in 100 years of dark. She could see in the round of the carbide light, the small white eyes of native silver in the ore mass, the dark violet of ruby silver, the lead gray of galena laced through, the whole face of the load carrying, at a rough Comstock estimate, a value her father had written into the margin of his notebook, and that Waldo had confirmed for her over the winter. She would have the ore assayed later. She would learn that the last car alone carried a value at $1932 of something over $11,000 in silver at the coin value. She did not think about the number in the tunnel. She thought about the ore. She put her hand on the ore. She said, "Papa." She said it once and did not say it again. Beneath the top load, in a small tin box she found when she cleared a hollow in the far corner of the ore car deck, was Bertram Aish's dispatcher's satchel. He had ridden the last car with the satchel on his lap. It had settled beside him when he settled against the brake wheel. She lifted it out. It was leather, cracked but intact. She opened it. Inside were a dispatcher's logbook in a small firm hand, and a folded single letter. The logbook was Bertram Aish's route log for the last month of the Anselm and Payne combine. The last entry was the morning of the rock burst. It named the load. It named the men on the crew, 3 brakemen and a driver and himself. It named the ventilation as poor and the drift as making air but slow. It said, at the bottom, that he would ride the last car out himself because the load was heavier than the combine had insured, and if a brakeman lost her, he would not be able to say to himself in the mill office, that he had not been there. The letter was addressed to Ephraim Aish at a Nevada City, California, boarding house. She would learn later that Ephraim Aish had been Bertram's son. Bertram had lost a wife in 1829 and had raised his son alone until the boy was 17, and, in a quarrel that Bertram had won by force of will and lost by everything else, had run off to California in 1832 and had not written home in the year since. She opened the letter. Bertram Aish had written that he had, for the whole of the year since Ephraim had left, called every ore train down the line to the mill on time. He had not missed a shift. He had not missed a call. He had run the dispatch office like the office was his family. He had, he wrote, called every ore train down the line and had never called his own son home. He wrote that Ephraim had been right to leave. He wrote that the dispatch office was a poor substitute for a supper table. He wrote that if the letter reached his son, he would like Ephraim to know that he was sorry, and to know that he understood, at 59, what Ephraim had understood at 17, that a father who calls every other man's train and does not call his own son home is not, in the end, the man he had thought he was. He asked forgiveness. He said he would be on the last car of the shift. He signed his name. He wrote under the name, in a smaller hand, Ephraim, if you find this, come back. The mountain will hold the load. I could not hold you. I will do better. Rena sat down on the tunnel floor with the letter in her lap. The carbide lamp threw a yellow round at her boots. The tunnel was still. She could hear, very far off, the small breath of the ventilation shaft moving air. She read the letter again. She copied it into her father's notebook, word for word, in pencil. She refolded Bertram Aish's original in the oilcloth she had brought for the purpose. She whispered Ephraim Aish's name aloud. She walked out of the drift at pace 730 with the letter and the dispatch book and a small sample of the ore for the assay office. She reached the shaft. She climbed up. Slate was waiting where she had left him. He put his head against her boot and did not bark. The mill combine, learning of the find within the week, filed a claim on the ore on the ground that the West Shoulder patent was theirs. The state on Rena's evidence, Warren's notebook, Waldo's map, the recorder's permit, the language of the amended abandoned property statute, ruled otherwise. The ore was Corinna Bly's under the statute, subject to a royalty to the state, which she paid without argument. The B Street house, on Rena's separate suit through a Reno lawyer Waldo had named, came back to her. Melchior Trask's trust document was struck. The judge did not need long. Melchior left the Comstock within the month. He was heard of, a year later, working for the mill combine at Tonopah. Rena did not go looking. She had, by then, other work. She sent a letter to Nevada City, California, on the strength of a name she had gotten from the old Anselm and Payne Combine's papers at the State Archive. Ephraim Aish, she learned, had lived out his life in Nevada City as a shopkeeper and had died in 1928. He had, however, left a granddaughter who had married a man named Toller and lived in Sacramento and who was 63 and who received Rena in a small brick house near the state fairgrounds with a cup of coffee and a slow, careful look at the letter. Mrs. Toller read her great-grandfather's letter. She read it twice. She looked up. She said, "My grandfather told me once that his father had never asked him to come home. It bothered him his whole life." Rena said, "He did ask. He never mailed it." Mrs. Toller held Rena's hand across the table a long minute. They drank the coffee. Rena had the ore assayed and hauled out over the course of the following year. The value came to more than she had expected and less than the mill combine had feared. She used it. She bought back the West Shoulder claim from the mill combine at market. She reopened her father's old timber shop at the Yellow Jacket Works for repairs and small custom work and paid Waldo Ipes a foreman's wage to run it. She paid off the widow's boarding house. She paid the county for Bertram Aish's stone. She bought a small brick building on B Street 100 yards from her house and put a plate on the door that read Bly Rail Inspection and Timber Recovery. And she did the work of the Comstock for the next 38 years, walking abandoned drifts for the state, recovering stalled cars, inspecting old adits before the state permitted them to be sealed for good. She trained 4 apprentices. She paid them fair. She did not marry. She was asked once by a Reno lawyer she thought a great deal of, and she said she was grateful and unavailable, and she thought about it afterward. But not for long. Slate is buried at the fence corner nearest the west grade, where he liked to sit in the late light. There is a smooth granite stone over him, with his name scratched in with a masonry point. The brass carbide lamp is on the mantel of the B Street house, which Rena left in her will to the County Historical Society, along with her father's notebook and her copy, in her own pencil, of Bertram Aish's last letter. Waldo Ipes died in 1938 and was buried at Silver Terrace next to Warren Bly and Bertram Aish, as he had asked. Rena laid the last of the coping stones on his grave herself. Some things a person learns only in the dark of a mountain. Rena learned, over the years, that Bertram Aish had called every ore train down the line to the mill and had not called his own boy home, and that her own father had walked the Anselm drift and had left the ore where it was because the load was not his, and had said, in the margin of his notebook, that the mountain had been keeping her a school fund. What had been in the last car was, in coin value, a fortune. What had been in the tin box beside Bertram Aish was worth more. It was a letter a man had died writing and had not been able to mail, and it had been waiting for the woman who could carry it out. The mountain does not read letters, but it will hold one for 100 years if you ask it to. The Comstock said, the fall Corinna Bly filed her permit, that the Anselm adit had nothing in it and never had. It had a train in it. It had a man in it. It had a letter in it. The mountain had been keeping all 3, patient as any mountain is patient, waiting for the daughter of the timberman who had knocked on its door in 1918 and had let it be. If you have ever been the one who had to open a door in the dark for a message somebody else could no longer deliver, drop a comment below and tell us what was in it. I read them all. See you in the next one.